One of the nicest parts about having a large family is when you get to visit them for the holidays. And in 2016, I was going to do just that. At the time, I had been living in Northern California and decided to go stay with my parents for the holidays at their cabin in Colorado. I was planning it as a huge surprise too, and originally I had intended on just showing up unannounced. But instead, I came up with an idea that I thought would be infinitely better. I was going to show up at the cabin a few days before them, so that when they showed up, I could have it decorated for them. It was going to be amazing. So I figured out that my parents were going to be showing up at the cabin on December 20th of that year, and decided to go there 2 days before them. But to make sure that I didn't accidentally spill the beans, I made sure not to talk to them at all after the 15th, to give myself some time to prepare. Now, if I had spoken to them, I would have found out that they had to cancel their flights to Colorado due to a blizzard that was set to hit on the 20th. But I had no clue, and on December 18th, I flew to Colorado and caught a ride to my parents' cabin, where I used the key that I had on my keychain to get in. The first night I just relaxed, but the entire next day I spent putting up the lights and setting up the living room to look nice for them when they showed up. But as the sun began to set, I noticed that it was starting to snow outside, and I immediately grew concerned. It only got worse from there. It was about 1 in the morning when I noticed the power went out around me, and I decided to give up on my surprise plan and called my parents to see if there was a generator. And as soon as they realized I was at the cabin, they freaked out. But not in the way that seemed like they were excited. They were immediately concerned and let me know that there was a really intense snowstorm heading my way. And when I told them that the power had gone out, they only worried more. You see, the driveway leading up to the cabins was a gravel path through the woods that spanned the length of about 2 football fields. In other words, with the snow piling up the way that it was, there was no way for me to get out. And to make matters worse, I didn't bring much food because I assumed my family would be bringing some. All I could do at that point was hope that the storm passed sooner than expected and I could get out of there. That wasn't the case though. It snowed for 5 days straight, and the service roads leading up to the mountain that I was on had apparently been shut down. My phone's battery was low, so I decided to turn it off for use in an emergency. And from that moment on, I spent most of my time reading anything that I could. I managed to keep the cabin warm using the wood that I had piled up the night that I got in, and I melted snow on the wood stove to make drinking water. But by the time the 4th day rolled around, I was starving. I hadn't had anything to eat in over 48 hours and was getting really desperate. I looked in the cabinets and ended up finding 3 cans of ravioli that had been in there for years, if not longer. At that point, I would have eaten anything though, so I didn't waste any time putting the can directly on the wood stove to begin heating up its contents. It only took me 10 minutes before realizing how bad of a decision I had made. In no time at all, I was keeled over, clenching my stomach in pain. I turned my phone on and called my parents to see if they thought it was serious. And after realizing the food that I had eaten was more than likely more than a decade old, they had me call the hospital, which transferred me over to poison control. That's when I learned how terrifying botulism was. According to the person I spoke to, if I didn't get help soon, there was a chance that my body would become deeply infected and I could ultimately die. They ended up sending a helicopter to airlift me to the hospital since the roads were still closed in the area around my cabin, and I'm glad they did. By the time they got there, which was only an hour after my call, I had developed a fever over 106 degrees and could feel an intense heat coursing through my body. I was hospitalized for 3 days afterward, 2 of which were spent simply monitoring my vitals and making sure that my organs hadn't been damaged.
Back in 2017, I worked as a delivery driver for Uber Eats to make some extra money on the side. It wasn't the best paying job, but it was something to help me get by my struggles as a growing adult. I was 25 years old, and I'm sure most of you know how life really sets in at that age. Anyway, I live in the suburbs of New York. Not the city, just the state, as I was never a city person, but lived near it. Throughout my life, I've always been more of a quiet person, which is why I really like the suburban areas. One night, I was doing some late night delivery orders to keep the income flowing when there had been an incoming weather report. The snow had been falling pretty hard and the winds were measuring well over 50 kilometers and that a blizzard was on its way. That being said, I still wanted to do a few more orders for the night. Luckily, I had received one order from someone on the other side of town. It wasn't too far, but this person barely met the delivery radius. I was annoyed because of the distance, but I realized it was another tip. I bit my lip and drove to the restaurant and to the given address. All the while, the falling snow began to come down fast and the winds were starting to pick up. On top of that, the snow on the sidewalks were already starting to pile up, so I knew I had to get there in time. I arrive at the destination and there's this man standing outside of his terrace house wearing several layers of clothing. Just by looking at him, he did not seem like a pleasant type of man. It was one of those men that screamed stranger danger. He comes up to my car and I proceed to hand him his food when he begins to ask for some money. I ask him what it was for, to which he then says that his car had been out of gas. Okay, so I wasn't sure why that was my problem, but being nice and not wanting to piss him off, I hand him a $10 bill and wished him luck. He looked down at the money and then looked back at me with a blank expression as if he wanted more. He then said that it wasn't enough and that I could at least do 50. I told him that was all I had, but that maybe someone else could help him. The look on his face that day is something that will never leave me. It was a look of hatred and anger, as if I were his sworn enemy. I then tell him to enjoy and drove off away from the building. Doing that, however, was probably the most stupidest decision of my life. I hear two loud bangs echo through the streets along with something hitting my back tire. It didn't take me long to realize that these bangs were actually gunshots. Suddenly my car swerves from left to right and the ice didn't make it any better. Eventually, I managed to get a hold of the wheel and drive back with my back tire making this awful noise. However, I was afraid of what might happen if I stopped my car in case he was following me somehow. Thankfully, I had gotten home safely just in time and didn't once look back. Police were called and I reported the incident to Uber, but nothing ever became of it. After all, this did happen in the Bronx, which isn't the safest place in the city. I guess I learned my lesson not to assume that everything I do is safe, when in reality it isn't. It was the fall of 2015 and I just finished my first semester in college, meaning winter break would finally be upon me. I live in upstate New York, and around this time of year, it would become exceedingly cold in my area with temperatures dropping below the 30s. Growing up in the cold, I wasn't bothered by it and actually enjoyed it to a certain extent. One night, my mom had been out with a friend, leaving me to tend to the house alone. I didn't mind staying alone, as I like to think of myself as mature and responsible, and I could really use the quiet. Now, the house we lived in was located in the more rural side of my city. It wasn't like the country, but houses here were far apart and the nearest grocery store was about 9 miles. With nothing to do, I throw myself onto my couch and put on some Netflix to fall asleep to. So there I am, bored out of my mind, watching Orange is the New Black when the power goes out. Living in a cold area where the winds are strong, it wasn't uncommon for it to go out once in a while. With nothing to do at this point, I closed my eyes and tried to fall asleep until my parents came home. I probably slept on the couch for about a good 2 hours when I for some reason wake up. The power is still out, so I couldn't see anything in the room other than the faint glow from the moon. However, I started having this weird feeling in the room. You know that sensation you get when you can just feel someone's watching you? Yeah, I had that in spades. I sat bolt upright while letting my eyes adjust to the dark, and right then I could see the outline of something tall beside the couch. By some miracle, the power comes back on, and about 2 feet away is a man standing over me. He looked to be in his mid-30s, was very tall and lanky, wearing a torn white shirt and some cargo pants. The thing that made the situation 10 times creepier was the fact that parts of his clothes were covered in blood. My blood ran cold as he stared down at me with this menacing glare of utter shock. I say I stared at him for a good 10 seconds before he says something along the lines of, who are you? I say in an angry tone, who are you and what the hell are you doing inside of my house? He then went on to explain that he was driving when his car skidded across the road from the ice, crashing into a large tree, and he came to the nearest house looking for help. It didn't take me long to realize that the blood on his clothes was his. In the heat of the moment, I thought his story was bullshit, but I didn't want to be rude. I tell him that there was nothing I could do and that if he didn't leave, I would call the cops. He didn't respond to this and started walking around the living room looking for stuff. Needless to say, I called the police and explained the situation to the operator. They said that it could take a while for an officer to get here due to the extreme weather conditions. I'm 5'8", that weighed around 150 pounds, and this guy was massive, so I couldn't take him on even if I tried. All the while, he's going through cabinets, opening doors, and wouldn't listen to me when I told him to stop. I could only assume that he was on something and prayed the police would be here soon. Turns out, his so-called bullshit story turned out to be 100% true. 2 police officers came to my door 15 minutes later and told me that he was indeed in a car crash. I felt so bad for him, assuming he was an intruder when the guy was just wanting some help. Apparently, the impact of the crash shocked him to the point where he didn't know what he was doing, which explained him searching through my living room. Long story short, he was sent to a hospital and me nor my mom pressed any charges. My parents didn't let me stay home alone after that until a few years later. This is by far the most strangest incident I've ever come across in my 9 years of living in that house. Even though I felt sympathy for the man, this story still scares me till this day. I'm 22 now and I have moved past it. But there's still one question I have. How did he get inside of my house? The thing is, my parents always keep our doors locked.
Many years ago, when I was a kid, I used to go sledding with my younger brother every time it snowed. There was a hill at a park a few blocks away, and we could walk to it. Every time it snowed, we would go there, and all the kids from the neighborhood would go to it as well. One year, when I was about 10, me and my little brother, who was 2 years younger than me, noticed it was snowing out. It was already nighttime, but as it was a Friday, we knew the next day our local hill would be packed with kids, so we asked our mom if we could go that night. I don't know exactly what time it was looking back, but I'd guess it was about 7 or 8 o'clock. Our mom said we could, but we had to be back within an hour. My brother and I got on our winter coats and snow pants and took our sleds to the hill. It took maybe 10 minutes for us to walk to the park, and as we were walking, the snowfall got heavier and heavier. By the time we got there, it was really coming down, and we saw that there was nobody else at the park at all. The hill was getting coated in fresh snow. My brother and I raced up to the top and then slid down. It was great to have the whole park to ourselves, sliding down and going back up over and over again. One of the times when we reached the top of the hill, we noticed a man standing towards the bottom of it. He was really far away, but he appeared to just be staring at us. It was kind of weird to see an empty park at night in the middle of a blizzard with just one man standing at the bottom of a hill staring. My brother and I decided to wait for a minute or so to see if he would go away before we slid down the hill again. He kept standing there for at least a minute or so, maybe 2, and finally walked about 20 feet away and sat on a park bench, but continued to watch us. My brother and I were naturally taught to be careful of strangers, and the guy was seeming suspicious. We decided to slide down the hill one more time and then leave the park to go home. When we got to the bottom, I saw a closer look of the man. He seemed sort of old, but I couldn't make out much else in the snowfall and him wearing a big coat. My brother and I then walked out of the park and left. We walked home in the snow for roughly the 10-minute walk. When we made it back home, we got back inside and had some hot chocolate. After that, we got ready for bed. As I was going down the hallway from the bathroom to my bedroom, I noticed something out the window. The man who we had seen at the park was standing at the edge of our yard on the street, staring at our house. I called my brother over, and just after he got there, we watched the man walk away. He didn't get into a car or anything, he just walked down the street. But after that, he was never seen again. A couple of years ago, I was going on a long road trip for work, which I did quite often with my old job. It was winter time, and as I drove down the road late at night, I noticed it start to snow. Pretty soon, it was a heavy snowfall that was sticking on the ground and causing the road to become very slippery and dangerous to drive on. I hadn't really been paying attention to the weather, but I knew at this point it would be dangerous to continue. I decided to pull off the freeway at the next stop, hoping there would be some hotels or something. Unfortunately, there were none, and the next stop was just a truck stop. I pulled into it off the freeway anyways, and saw a decent amount of trucks and other cars there. The place was starting to get busy from all the snow and the people getting off the roads. I went around and parked in an open parking spot, and decided to just sleep there and wait out the snow. It was a busy road I had been on, so I figured it would get plowed overnight. I went inside the truck stop to use the bathroom, and then walked back out to my car. As I did, I could already see almost an inch of snow had fallen onto my car. I got into my car and began covering up my windows. I did the same thing for whenever I slept in my car. I covered all the windows with certain blankets that I had, so nobody could see in the car at all. Then I laid in the back seats of my car, which was just long enough for me to lay down in. I had several other blankets that I had in back with me, so I wasn't too worried about getting cold. I closed my eyes, and it didn't take long for me to fall asleep, but I woke up sometime in the middle of the night. I had no idea what time it was. I'd been sleeping well, so I knew something had woken me up. I couldn't see out of any of my windows because of the blankets. Then I heard the sound of a scratching coming from the outside of my car. It got louder and louder. It sounded like it was on my driver's side. It stopped for a minute, but eventually I heard someone try to open the driver's door to my car. I wasn't quite sure what to do because nothing like this had ever happened before. I laid there for about a minute as whoever was there tried to enter my car, testing out each door one at a time. I was really happy that my car was locked. I looked at my phone and thought about calling the police. It was 4:30 in the morning. Then the noises stopped, until suddenly I heard a loud bang come from the back window next to me. Thankfully, the window didn't break, but I thought it might, so I jumped and got into the driver's seat and started the car. I pulled the blanket off the window and drove away. I could feel myself sliding in the snow as I did. I looked in my mirror and saw someone, but couldn't make out anything about them. It was snowy and dark, and they were a good 30 feet behind me. I kept driving back onto the road, which was not as slippery as it had been before, but it was still lightly snowing. I slowly and carefully drove up about 20 miles to a town with a hotel and slept there the rest of the night. This happened when I was 15. I was a sophomore in high school and got home from school one afternoon in December to realize I was home alone. I saw a note on the counter from my mom saying that her and my dad were going shopping and would be back later that night. She left me some money to order a pizza, which I was pretty excited about. I did my homework, then ordered the pizza and watched TV. Then I played some video games. It had been snowing earlier in the day, and by the time it was 7 p.m., it was really coming down. I kept playing video games, and finally at about 9, my mom called me telling me she was on her way home, but might not be there for another hour or so because of the snow. I decided to go outside and look to see just how much we had gotten. I was also going to maybe shovel the driveway. I stepped out the front door to see several inches of fresh snow everywhere. It was so smooth, except for this one place. I noticed some footprints in the snow that were in my yard. There seemed to be someone who walked in my yard and then went over to the garage. It was strange to me. There usually weren't people walking in my yard. I went back inside and suddenly had the thought to check the garage door, which was connected to our house. I went over to it and saw that it was unlocked. I started to walk closer to lock it, but thought I heard a noise right from the other side of it. This really freaked me out, and I ran upstairs to my room. I locked my door and hid under my bed. About a minute later, I heard the noise of my garage door opening. I wanted my parents to get home badly, but knew they wouldn't be home for almost an hour. I heard the sounds of someone walking around downstairs in my house. At that point, I decided to call the police. Thankfully, I had my phone on me, and I dialed 911. I spoke as quietly as I could, and hoped whoever was downstairs didn't hear me. I could barely hear them walking around downstairs, and I heard them walking around for quite a while. I had no idea what they were doing, but I was kicking myself for not making sure the garage door was locked earlier. I sat upstairs under my bed until I started to hear the footsteps coming up the stairs. It was the most scared I had ever been, until finally I heard the sound of police sirens off in the distance. The footsteps then went back downstairs and seemed to leave. I waited until the police came inside my house to leave my bedroom. When I did, I saw the main level of our house was all messed up. My parents were called and got home a little bit later. It seemed like just a typical break-in of a guy trying to find valuables in our house. I'm just glad I was able to get upstairs and call the police when I did.
My name is Corey, and I lived in the States ever since I could remember. It was around 6 p.m. one night in the winter, and I was staying at my girlfriend's family vacation house due to a snow blizzard. It was our second week there, and the surroundings were astonishing. The house belonged to my girlfriend's grandparents before they passed, and ever since then, we'd always go up there for the winter. Now, the blizzard wasn't too strong, but the snowfall was coming down hard with about 2 feet of snow. We had just eaten lunch, and after that, I decided I'd go on a walk like I always do. I know, stupid to go out in a blizzard, but it was mild and didn't really pose a threat to us. The house was very close to a forest in the mountains, as this was a more rural part of the state. Going outside and enjoying the cold winter forest looked and felt amazing. My girlfriend had even said she would make us some hot cocoa while I was gone. Now, the forest I normally hike in has 2 separate paths. one that has a more rocky terrain and one that doesn't. Playing it safe, I decided I'd take the trail with the least amount of treachery, as I knew there was a risk of slipping due to the slushy ice. Without hesitation, I go through the more smoother trail and didn't think anything of it. I've been through both of these trails in the past, but I didn't feel like doing anything extreme. So there I was, walking through the woods, listening to one of my playlists when my iPod died. Annoyed, I take out my phone and record a few videos of my hike to post on my Instagram story. Not that anyone cared, but I liked recording my experiences wherever I went. It was up until this point that I had been hiking for about a half hour now and was debating on whether to call it a day. However, there had been a small forest clearing just up ahead and decided I'd take a look around. Upon entering the clearing, I immediately noticed strange objects laid out in the snow. The strange part was that they were neatly arranged in a sort of pyramid-like structure. I move a few feet closer, and it was then when I realized that these so-called objects were bones of what seemed like a giant animal. Maybe cow, maybe a horse, or even buffalo. They were completely clean and sun-bleached. This meant that someone out there had placed these on purpose. What that purpose was, I have no idea. I was just on this trail a few days before and had seen no bones. There were also a few bones that were alike and had been neatly arranged in a circle that laid in the snow. Suddenly, the snow began to pick up as I stared down at the bones when I got the feeling that I wasn't supposed to be here. It was then when I heard quite a ways into the woods a loud snap that echoed across the trees. I take a quick photo of my discovery and try my best to run back to the house. All the while, I'm taking big steps into the deep blankets of snow, going as fast as I can. I make it back to the house and show my girlfriend the picture I took. She began to freak out as well, and we both thought why someone would go through the struggle to do this. I'm still not sure if it was just some punk trying to scare people or something much worse. Either way, I haven't been back up there since, but my girlfriend's parents have. This time, the bones were gone.